All right, welcome back. We've returned from the floor and we'll be picking up our work on S17. So Mr. Devlin, I believe you're here to walk us through the changes in draft 4.2.
Thank you very much for having me back, Chair McCarthy. Again, for the record, my name is Tim Devlin, Legislative Counsel. Committee members, before you, you will have draft 4.2 of this committee's strike-all amendment to S17. The updates since the last iteration you looked at have been highlighted for reference, and the first update can be found on page 11. If you scroll down there to section 5C, regarding Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriff's semicolon position, the reference to the funding for the position of Department of State's Attorney, the position of Director of Sheriff's Operations, funding has been removed, leaving with just one section. So I've removed subsection. Now simply state that the following position is created.
My comment when I heard that there was still a little bit of ambiguity about exactly how this would get resolved, given that we have testimony that there's a position available, but it's really a Department of Human Resources process. I would anticipate that when we send this to appropriations, they may have a small technical amendment to make this match up with the budget in some way, but I wanted to at least keep the creation of the position in here and just take out the reference to it getting paid for in some other way that meets with the committee's approval. Okay. Well, our colleagues across the hall might say, oh, wait a minute, we got to do this to make it work with the budget, but we'll figure that out.
The next update we find in 12 under Sheriff's duties, specifically section 6, subsection D. And this is the part that speaks to Sheriff's duty to provide standby services, or really the escort services for individuals who have relief from abuse orders to pick up their personal belongings from their residence. And now it will still require sheriffs to do so, but really only if another primary law enforcement agency for that location is unavailable. And I'll just read through this from line 15. Sheriff's departments providing law enforcement services in the county in which an individual who has a relief from abuse order pursuant to 15 VSA, section 1103 resides, shall have a duty to assist in the retrieval of personal belongings of the individual and that individual's dependents from the individual's residence, provided, however, that no other primary law enforcement agency for that location is available within a reasonable time frame to provide the assistance. Quote, primary law enforcement agency, end quote, as used in this section, shall mean a law enforcement agency responsible for providing law enforcement services in a certain town, city, or village by statute or contract. New subsection E, which expands the prohibition on fee seeking for the service from the victim, that is, now reads, no law enforcement officer or law enforcement agency shall seek a fee from the individual seeking assistance or being assisted in the retrieval of personal belongings from the residence pursuant to subsection D of this section or any representative of the individual. I'll pause there for a moment.
So I just want to know for the committee, I'm not sure if it just went, yeah, I think it just came to Andrea, but Karen Transcript Scott had emailed that she has some concerns about, I guess to summarize that, and I might have her either try to join us or send us a suggested edit, but this idea that, and would this require the person who was seeking a standby service to sort of contact the primary law enforcement agency and then wait? Because I think that's the thing that I was worried about as we were trying to solve the issue for the sheriffs, is that now we're putting an onus on a survivor to sort of figure out which agency is the appropriate one, and then they could just point their fingers at each other and then there's nobody to sort of serve them.
As written, and when it doesn't really speak to who would be contacted first. It could play out as well that a sheriff's department is contacted, and then they in turn would seek confirmation from the primary law enforcement agency, whether they're available or not. But that could be certainly clarified and specified to address your point more explicitly.
Does anybody else have any? I'm struggling because I really want to make sure that we're not sort of defaulting to the sheriffs automatically and having every single standby service sort of just automatically go to the sheriff. But I also don't want to put someone who's fleeing violence at their home in the position of having to sort of like negotiate with multiple law enforcement agencies about who's going to come and support them. We've quite nailed it here. Representative Nugent.
Couldn't it, I mean, if whoever they end up calling first, couldn't those folks, if they weren't the primary, they communicate with the other law enforcement agency and like refer the call? So there's no delay, but they're not just getting defaulted to.
Like a warning here. So we might ask her. I'll go to Representative Hooper and then we'll.
This might be a stupid suggestion and immediately dismissed. But it won't be my first one.
We're trying to solve we're trying to solve a difficult problem. So I appreciate suggestions and, you know, we'll try not to ridicule you too much.
So at this point, we're throwing this responsibility on somebody that is in bad straits to begin with. And the court clerk just set up and basically say to the designated police association, law enforcement, here's your appointment, go there. And if they can't do it, they deal with the court.
So like a court.
Maybe that's not a study.
Like a court police office.
No, you got a designated agency.
Sure, yes.
So if you're the abused person, you go to the designated agency. You shouldn't necessarily have to. The court clerk should say to the designated agency, you got a relief from abuse order to execute. Here's when it's scheduled.
I think Karen may be able to shed some light on how this works in practice. So from my wife Stephanie's work with Voices Against Violence, I was kind of aware of the fact that network members, those agencies, oftentimes are providing assistance for survivors who are seeking an RFA and then following up on it, and that they oftentimes are doing some of that support and coordination. But Karen, would you be willing to come on and talk to us a little bit about how this works in practice? And
Sure.
we're trying to square a circle here that's challenging.
Yeah,
And
thank
my
you.
effort is try to make this official rather than some kind of social.
Yeah, for the record, I'm Karen Tronsgard Scott, Executive Director of the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I so appreciate the care that you're taking with this conversation. So in fact, what happens across our state is many things. In many communities, our member organizations are helping to coordinate this. They are supporting the survivor, as we discussed this morning, helping them find the sheriff's department or other law enforcement agency to do a standby. The thing that is worrying to me is putting the onus on the survivor for being able to identify which law enforcement agency they should call. And because I don't think that's necessarily obvious. You know, I happen to live in Heinsberg, and so I know that we have a police department, but if I lived in a town that didn't have a police department, I wouldn't know who to call. And often time is of the essence. You know, there's a need to move rather quickly. And I can say that I'm concerned that, you know, survivors are under an awful lot of pressure. They're in situations that are dangerous, and asking them to hunt down, poor choice of words there, the right law enforcement agency is probably going to result in folks not getting support to retrieve their possessions, or not ever retrieving their possessions. So right now we have a system that's actually working. in most ways. The thing that isn't working is charging survivors for the service. And so that's, I'm, appreciate the opportunity to be able to express those concerns and talk a little bit about how things work today.
Representative Nugent, I saw your hand up. I have an idea, but let me think it through while you're.
I was just wondering, how it's working right now. Are they always calling the sheriffs? Just going back to that. So how it's working, they're going to the whatever law enforcement agency is available.
That's right. That's right.
So committee, radical shift here. What if we are just silent about who it is, acknowledging that there's at least some understanding of which agency is providing the service, and we just say no law enforcement agency is going to charge survivors for the service, and then we have our report back and we can revisit the who's the primary and how do these get doled out as we consider how big is this problem and what would funding it in an appropriate and fair way be when we get some more data next year. Do you think, Karen, if we just were silent about it being sheriffs and saying that we're just not going to charge survivors for this and then doing the report back would be preferable to the language we've got on the table today?
I appreciate that thinking. We have an opportunity. We actually have an opportunity here, and this is something that Sheriff Anderson and I have talked about a little bit. In other states that have, all states, law enforcement agencies provide standby services, and in many other states, there's actually a uniform protocol for how to do that all the law enforcement agencies and the victims advocacy community have agreed to, and so that's the opportunity that sits there. We brought this issue because we were concerned that survivors were being charged a lot. And, obviously, as the legislature's committed reforms to how sheriffs operate, we wanted to make sure that this issue was on the table. But we're very happy to work with the sheriffs and the Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association, and Vermont State Police to figure out how could we do this in a way that is really focused on public safety and focused on a uniform approach across all jurisdictions, which would eliminate a lot of the the devil in the detail part that you're grappling with today in this bill. I think that's a pathway forward, Chair, and appreciate your thinking about that.
Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. Is there, let's say that we do that, right? And then is the sheriff's office allowed to say, okay, I don't really want to pay for these, or I provide this, it's a pain in the neck and I don't have the money or the people to do it, and then say no, and then the Vermont State Police says no, or the local police department says no, and then all of a sudden there are people who need help that aren't getting it because they're being turned away by people who don't want to pay for it?
I think that
possibility exists.
I think that's a possibility, and it's something we've seen on occasion over time. But I have to go back to our joint commitment, our shared commitment to public safety and to the safety of survivors. And I would hate to think that any law enforcement officer or law enforcement leader in this state would engage in that approach. It would be really troubling to me. We know that in 2014, there was a survivor who attempted to get standby services and wasn't able to, and she was actually killed by her ex-partner. So that's a long time ago, but I bet it's not a long time ago for her family. And so I think that there's really good agreement, between the advocacy community and the law enforcement community that these are provisions that are needed and we need to sort this out. And again, I would really hate to think that any law enforcement leadership in this state would decide to not engage in a process that improves public safety. I would be very disappointed to hear that would happen. I hope not.
So I think where I am right now is that I like the prohibition on the payment, like where we've gotten with the report back. I think it might make sense to put the primary law enforcement agency language aside for this bill in this moment and go back to the compromise that was in, I think it was draft 3.1 or 3.2 earlier today, which basically said if the sheriffs are requested by to provide the service, that they'll provide the service. And that way, they kind of are the backstop. I think we might have opened up a bit of a can of worms with our attempt to try to define something that isn't currently defined anywhere else in statute, this idea of a primary law enforcement agency. How do other people feel about it?
I guess I feel like the putting aside that language is a good idea, making sure that it's clear that survivors would be for it. I feel like what I heard from sheriffs and others is that there's still a kind of a concern around whether or not they'll be able to provide the service. So what I'm hearing from Karen also, it sounds like it'd be maybe helpful to wait for the study to come back before we define that and assign that work. As long as it's happening, like those services are being provided currently.
Yeah, because we could be silent on the compulsion as long as there's the prohibition on the charging, and that would essentially be the status quo that we have today, except that the handful of agencies that have been charging survivors wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore. And I think that might solve our immediate problem, but leave open the question of sort of who's the provider of last resort in those cases where it's not clear which agency would be the default. Representative.
Could we go as far as to say any law enforcement agency contacted shall, rather than putting it squarely in the back to the sheriff now? Pull back.
I guess my question there would be if a survivor in Brattleboro calls the St. Albans Police Department, or if somebody in Heinsberg calls the Burlington Police Department and they don't provide law enforcement services in that town, would we be inadvertently compelling? Because what we have here is that we've tried to say the primary law enforcement agency that's in that community or that area. I think Tim did a great job in a short amount of time coming up with a way of defining that.
I guess, and maybe the wording should change, but again, I'm still thinking there still could be the pass along message of, well, that's not our responsibility, call the sheriffs, and, press 3 for, the next option, in which I'm sure would be frustrating for somebody involved in that, but just an idea. Again, I just have a little bit of a concern of, again, and it may be only for a short period of time until the report comes back, but placing it squarely in the back to the sheriffs at this point.
Representative Nugent.
Sorry, I forgot to add one thing, but it sounds like the opportunity that Karen's talking about to figure out a protocol, like as in other states, would be possible with this work that's happening. So I guess I'm curious to see and hopeful that would create a solution that works for everybody. And for right now, whatever we can do to make sure no one's paying and that things can continue as they have been.
Representative Hooper.
I'm sensitive to the fact that we're taking somebody that's just gone through the trauma of being assaulted, then getting a restraining order, and then saying, go deal with the bureaucracy of our law enforcement process. If Representative Higley's, notwithstanding your jurisdictional issue, said you shall, and if you can't, then you have to find somebody that does, it takes the onus off of the person and puts it on the administration of law enforcement, which might be a palatable solution. I just feel like we don't do anybody any favors by having them go bang on 3 or 4 doors to get their laptop or their cat.
Yeah, so I hear where you're going, Representative Cooper. So then the suggestion would be that we not just generalize the prohibition, but then generalize the mandate and say, law enforcement agencies providing services in the counties, towns, communities, et cetera, in which an individual has a relief from abuse order shall.
If you're designated, then you're designated, and if you can't do it, find somebody who can.
Along the same lines, I was just saying, taking on what Rep. Higley said was of any law enforcement agency that serves that area of jurisdiction. It kind of gets to what you're saying, Mr. Chair, in terms of, because, you had somebody call it St. Albans, it was in Brattleboro, because obviously the St. Albans PD that isn't their jurisdiction, but I'm just trying to spitball something that covers with it, but maybe we're overthinking it.
Well, I think we're getting close here. Tim, do you think it's possible to broaden out this language a little further so that the compulsion for the sheriffs to provide the service for standby, that it's really just the law enforcement agency, that any law enforcement agency that's contacted that serves that jurisdiction shall? Did we broaden that out? All right. Well, why don't we take a look at that in a subsequent draft?
And the only thing I would add to that is, would you still want to be located in Title 24 under sheriffs? If it was Title 20, closer to, I can think about that a little bit more. If I'd like to.
I will defer to you and your colleagues about where the proper location is. I think what our committee has realized in exploring this a little further is that this is a broader issue potentially than just sheriffs, but the fact that the sheriffs are kind of the provider of last resort in most of the counties, and oftentimes are just the ones providing law enforcement services, that we've kind of opened up a window into an area that really has a broader application. Representative Hooper.
I feel, some urgency to this, but not urgency to the point that if we can't work something out, that we throw in the committee to come up with something. The report. It would be great if we could.
So committee, I think we want to give Mr. Devlin some direction here before he goes to work in the Senate and we pick things back up. I'm inclined to at least take a look at some language that broadens this out if it needs to sit in a different title and we have a new section here. I think we should go ahead and try that.
Right.
Representative Moore?
Before we press to I know Tim hasn't talked to the very last piece yet, but while we're right in that vicinity, Sheriff Anderson caught Rep. Hooper to my right, Rep. Hooper, and just after we went on the break, on C, that's right above D that we're talking about, versus each sheriff's department shall comply with the provisions of the standard operating procedures, manuals, policy manuals created and maintained by the Department of State's attorneys and sheriffs. Excuse me. If you look back to 5B3, where we talked about the model policy development, excuse me, he was of the opinion that this now is drilling down, trying to get into the weeds of each of the 14 different jurisdictions of sheriffs. In other words, it'd be kind of like his analogy he gave me from the military vernacular is we have an agency called First Air Force that oversaw the unit he works for and the unit I worked for. And it would be like them telling you how to do airfield ops on the way your airfield is constructed. And he said we each are a little bit different in how we operate. And did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. And So he felt that really section C was no longer needed as a result of the development of the model policy. Again, concur? Okay.
So I had thought that we had resolved the sort of mismatch between the model policy and individual policies. What was the?
Specifically an administrative example, like budget preparation or report preparation, if the
Time cards, that kind of thing, yeah.
it's more into the minutia of administration as opposed to. if the
Big
model
picture
policy
operation.
Says, time cards need to be handed in Wednesday and yours come in on Friday. All of a sudden, he's adjusting something that he doesn't think he should have to. So.
Kate, Representative Nugent, sorry. Reading these two things and trying to understand the.
I guess I just thought model policy meant a directive to have a policy that like meets these criteria, X, Y, Z, not specified what the policy, you know what I mean? Like it would say you have to have some kind of policy that's consistent about time cards, but it doesn't get in, it wouldn't necessarily like tell each department when those time cards had to be delivered.
I think his concern is shall comply with the provisions.
Very directive and exacting.
So this is just 5B3. The Director of Sheriff's Operations shall develop, maintain, and provide each sheriff's department model policies on operational topics, including service civil process, relief from abuse orders, transport. That's what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Well. What we want them to do.
Right?
Yeah, I guess, here's what I'll say is that, when we have our break, because we're gonna have to pick this back up tomorrow, and I also want to give, Representative Barwicki a chance to be here. I think Sheriff Anderson is still local.
No, he left.
I
I pull him in.
The last we had heard from him, he was comfortable with this language, but I guess y'all aside.
Yeah, it was a last thing.
That might have just been a misread. Yeah. All right. So I know that Tim has to go. So I think what we'll do is look for Tim's suggestion on how to broaden out that language that we just requested for section 6. If a couple of us could, when we get done our work on the Lindenville Charter this afternoon, huddle up and see if there's any edits that we want to see in a hopefully ultimate draft tomorrow morning. Would the committee be all right with meeting like 15 minutes early tomorrow to take a roll through it? So maybe 45 of it. So if we end up voting at like 9:05 or something and start our other work a little bit late. Okay. So let's plan on starting at 8:45 tomorrow. And we'll, if anybody's interested in trying to come up with a suggestion on any last tweaks to section 5, happy to do that once we.
Yeah, we can get him on the phone or something and just get it. Maybe we're missing a piece of clarity that he might have had, but.
Yeah, I thought we had it square, but if he noticed something else that doesn't jive, then we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, Mr. Devlin, thank you for all your work on this. Looks like we've got one more round at least. Karen, thank you so much for joining us again and trying to work through some of these issues with us. Right.
May I speak?
Sure. Do you want to take the liberty?
Let's go.
For the record, Frank Stanley with Vermont Sheriff's Association. I just texted with Mark Anderson, Sheriff Mark Anderson, asking him if he was okay with 5.3b, and he said they are.
Terrific.
Yeah, this was just addressing though that did he say he was okay with C staying then, right? Under 6?
That was another question. I didn't ask that question.
Is that what he
The
said?
question I heard on the table was, are they okay with 5.3B? And that I got an affirmative on.
Yeah, I wrote here that he was okay with that, 5B3, but that could we look at striking C?
The sheriff's department shall comply with the provisions of the standard operating procedures manuals and policy manuals created and maintained by the department.
Comply is the bad word.
Okay.
Shall comply.
Well, I'll get back to it. Who has to take 45 in the morning?
Yeah, I think.
He's in a meeting from 2:30 to 4 now, so.
Yeah, so I think what we're gonna do is, before the end of the day here, try to get notes to legislative council. So when he gets out at 4, if he could offer us some feedback about 6C. So I was actually looking at the wrong.
Yeah, he just,
there.
He just texted me 5B good, 6C bad.
that's exactly.
Was he wearing like a loincloth and did he have a big club?
Well, maybe we better wait.
Caveman.
Well, he said he'd send us that joint text, so.
He's sad he could not.
He has spent a lot of time in the state house, so.
Right at the time when things are really happening, he has to go to a meeting, so.
Well, no, I mean, I think we're at the point now where there's broad agreement on this, and I think I want to make sure that none of the new language is sort of contradicting. So,
Take comply, would employ it.
well, I think what we really want is to make sure that any of those policies that they come up with don't contradict the model policies. So maybe we can just be explicit about that. If we need to be.
There you go.
So I think what we should do when we're done our work with the Linden bill with 490 is huddle up with Tim once he's out of the Senate, like right at 4 o'clock or something like that, if there's a couple of us, and ask him if we get rid of this, is that model policy coordination of the sub policies really covered above? And if it's not, then we can just put a reference in here instead of this particular language.
And maybe Frank can get clarity from them too.
Thanks, Frank. Representative Waters Evans.
Isn't all law complying? You know, like, I know there's like a legal definition of it, but I just feel like if we're writing a law here, if someone doesn't like being compelled to follow it, not someone, him personally, but you know what I mean, but just the whole point of this is to have the sheriffs comply.
I think
I mean, not the whole point, but part of the point.
the level of nuance that we're at right here is.
That's what I need is an explanation of the level of nuance, because I guess
That's
I'm
what
not
we're trying to do.
understanding why we wouldn't want a law with which people would comply.
So we're down with, if we're saying that they need to comply with all of the procedures and manuals, are we saying, for instance, the example that Representative Hooper was talking about, if they say, sheriffs should have a weekly payroll, but they want to do a biweekly payroll? Well, are we really saying that by law, we're compelling them to do a weekly payroll instead of a biweekly payroll? I think we could leave that to the discretion of the sheriff. But if we put this, if we're saying they need to comply with every single detail of every operating procedure and policy manual, now that I'm reading this again, I'm understanding the concern, which is that it might mean that every single suggestion that ever comes out of the department for administrative decisions, they'd be compelled in statute to comply with the exact details
To the nat.
So I think we just want to leave them enough flexibility where they can't contradict any of the model policies with their individual department's policies. That's really what I think we've been driving at.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we don't need to go to this level of compelling them to apply with the letter of every single suggestion that comes out.
So can't you just say that?
I'm about 99.9%.
We just need to write it up for us.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to translate that into like.
We're so close.
That's the legislative intent. That is the legislative intent.
Yeah. Well, I know, but like, if the language exists, we can just say it. Right.
So it sounds like we're two small things away from being able to have a final version of this bill. Since we've got Tucker back from the throes of the Senate, and I believe we're like ready to rock and roll on H490. I'd like us to go ahead and switch gears and pick up our work on this charter bill, and then we'll try to get these notes over to Tim, who's already got most of what we need, and then we'll square the circle on 6C later. So Tucker, would you like to come back up and walk us through the latest and greatest 490?
So 1.1.
Draft 1.1, I believe.
Yes, although I have a draft 1.2 ready because you'll notice that the numbering for the instances of amendment skips 5. Yes. So I had to renumber them.
Okay.
And there is the possibility for more amendments because as I just sat there and said, I should probably do a scan of the bill before the committee commits to both the amendment and the bill. Remember that there were 3 spelling errors in the bill that needed to be fixed. So I can add those. I'll point them out to you. I can add those if that is something you would like to do. But yes, draft 1.1 has 7 instances of amendment labeled as 8. The first instance of amendment replaces 30th with 60th for when the ordinances adopted by ordinance initiative shall take effect. So the 60th day, not the 30th day following adoption. The second instance of amendment will likely merit some discussion. This is the replacement for section 14, which previously was the section that allowed ordinances to be adopted with up to a $10,000 penalty that would toll each day. That has been replaced by the section 14 you see in the second instance of amendment on line 13. Covered bridges, penalty for violation of legal limits. That is language that is borrowed directly from the Title 23 provisions in 23 VSA 1434 subsection C that govern violations of legal limits, height and weight put on covered bridges. Notwithstanding that section of Title 23, the town may adopt an ordinance governing operator damage, that is the term used in Title 23, to covered bridges. It provides for a civil penalty, not criminal, of not more than $10,000 or an amount equal to the costs of repairing the damage to the covered bridge.
So this would have the effect of striking the really broad language with the case by case, all of that would go away.
Correct.
The ability for the town to adopt penalties for ordinances that aren't related to this would max out with general law.
Correct.
Entirely be relying on general law at $800 being the maximum. And they would have to set, so they would have to say a violation of this ordinance is $200 and it would just be that for any violation. That's all general law. But in the specific case of operator damage to covered bridges, a civil penalty of not more than $10,000 or an amount equal to the cost of repairing the damage to the covered bridge. So we're giving them that ability and they would have to adopt what they want, but we're being permissive.
That is correct.
Okay, I got some hands up. So Representative Chase, and we'll work our way around.
And I'm reading this, that they would have the option of, like, even if it was only a $500 worth of damage, they could still assess a penalty of up to $10,000. And they could choose based on whatever they felt like.
Or potentially the type of damage. Violation of a weight restriction on a covered bridge is likely to cause less damage than height restriction where you take out the cross beams of the covering.
Representative Higley and Representative Byron.
Tucker, I don't have the original bill in front of me, but wasn't there also a provision in there about any time period that after that could be an additional penalty.
Yes, that is also removed.
So I guess my next question too, though, is, I know they initially had $10,000 in there. If you go higher than that, is it still considered a civil penalty?
This is expressly being adopted as a civil penalty. So this is recoverable only through the civil division of the Superior Court.
So they
Could not be.
20,000.
It would be limited here expressly by not more than $10,000.
I guess, my only concern is hearing from, was it the town manager that said that one of the bridge accidents caused over $40,000 in just engineering fees alone. And I want to make sure that that's fine.
Wouldn't that be covered?
By the second clause.
I'm sorry.
That's exact. That was my question. That or amount gets you above the 10 if need be.
The way that this is structured is that the ordinance could either identify a set penalty, which could go up to
At maximum $10,000, or the ordinance could provide that the civil penalty would be an amount equal to the damage caused to the structure.
And set up that way, just following it through, and I know this might be a little outside of your normal area of expertise, but if the town said, this cost us $80,000 to repair this bridge, and somebody said there's no way, and they appealed that penalty that was assessed, the court would then decide what damages to award the town.
The court could review how the damages were calculated and determine whether those were as this puts it, the costs of repairing.
So there would be recourse for somebody who felt like the town.
And there are provisions within Vermont statute that use the term actual cost, which is something that you could add in here. So for example, the Public Records Act provides that agencies can charge the actual cost of producing a copy of a record. It takes more than 30 minutes to produce.
Oh, that was discussed at one point, I recall.
That was.
I see Representative Lee smiling with fond memories of classes.
So that is something that you could change here, is add in the term actual so that they could assess it as an amount equal to the actual cost of repairing. And that would give a reviewing court additional opportunity to review how the costs were calculated and determine their actual cost.
That sounds good to me. How do we feel about the addition to
Actual
actual?
non-costs.
Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
Cleared up my question. Marty, do you think that this flexibility around a civil penalty up to 10,000 or the actual cost of repairing the bridge will satisfy the desire?
Yes, oh, yes, I think that would satisfy. I just question whether you need the word actual. I would think if somebody contests it in court, the town's gonna say, look, I got that, and somebody might say, that was not real cost. There's not real cost.
It's just perceived.
Right.
Right.
Well, I suppose you could consider,
An estimate.
estimate or a cost being certain number of days being out of service, and what's that inconvenience cost, if there is such a thing, or things like that. But if you mean actual cost, I presume you're talking about replacing timbers and painting and engineering studies to shore up the understructure of that, which is reasonable.
Representative Hooper.
So when we go to actual cost, we're down here at the finish end of the project. If we do something based on an estimate, we're at the front of the project, so it becomes an issue of who's financing between those 2 points. And if it's a major construction project, the town's gonna be on the hook to do the job and then present the actual bill for what happened.
That is indeed what happened in one occasion. We couldn't get an agreement from the people that caused the most serious damage. And the town couldn't wait long enough to try to negotiate that out. So the town just went ahead and fixed the bridge, accumulated the costs, and then presented them to the.
Or you hired a contractor or something, but I don't think the person or the company probably because it goes to the truck. That did the damage is necessarily going to step forward immediately.
No, I mean, they were given an estimate. But they were not forthcoming in agreeing to pay. So the town just went ahead and did it and then presented their costs.
So we're talking about like a bridge loan here or something.
Well,
I didn't realize that was gonna be a joke.
but I mean, I guess that's like what the road release road in between like what the estimate is and the cost completion. Right. You guys are killing me. So, hey, I'm just picking up on it.
Well,
no,
with this language, I thought we were eliminating an estimate.
Yeah, but I mean, right, I guess that's the difference between the actual and the perceived estimate is the perceived cost, the actual cost of the completion of the scope.
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
All right, so let's focus. Let's get back onto it. I think, what's wrong with you? I think I've been convinced that we could leave this, that we could leave this language as is, but,
You're saying it's water under the bridge.
It's gonna be. Okay, all right, let's, I think we have, driven this one off.
Probably the ideas we can float.
This committee in the afternoon is very. It's really silly. It's about the next instance of.
Okay.
The third instance of amendment
Is in section 27. Fairly straightforward, eliminates the opening clause, which formerly allowed with approval of the select board, the board of listers to appoint the assessor. And instead now it just says that the select board may appoint. The fourth instance of amendment is in section 33 of the bill, which governs select board meetings. All of the language in this section is exactly the same as the underlying bill, but the three issues identified by the committee have been removed. So for example, that would include the reference to the Title 17 provisions governing the Board of Civil Authority, that accept clause that was originally in subsection C. The restriction on votes in executive session has been removed. And subsection F, which allowed the select board to add items to the agenda at the meeting, is removed as well. But otherwise, everything in this section stays the same as the underlying bill.
Relying on general law for those. Questions there? Way easier than covered bridge damages, the rest of these. All right.
One quick question from Marty, back to the bridges seriously though. Is there any vandalism problems with the bridges or is it all vehicular damage?
Structural damage.
Okay. And
Collisions with the bridge.
And this ordinance could theoretically cover both, right, Tucker?
It's specific to operator damage using the terms that are used in Title 23. So this would be the operator of a motor vehicle that violates legal limits that are adopted in the ordinance. So that would be weight and height restrictions primarily. I'm not aware of other legal limits on covered bridges that apply to motorists.
It just occurred to me, like I remember something not too long ago about somebody arsoning a covered bridge.
Oh,
That would likely be subject to the criminal provisions.
Yeah, I was like, there are bigger laws than the municipal authority. I think that would cover it.
As far as replacing it.
Jars of gas.
Yeah, so again, in those cases of where there's a crime, part of the sentencing can be about the recovery of damages, but that's, way beyond the jurisdictional scope of the town at that point, to when it gets into the criminal.
The governance maturity.
Right.
The fifth instance of amendment. This is the change from a reference to any election for when the ballot boxes shall be open to town elections. So nothing in that section 42, subsection B, is changed other than changing any election to town elections. And it requires that it be open for 9 consecutive hours.
Representative Wood?
But was that for any 9 consecutive hours? Like, could they decide to open it from 1 a.m. to 9 a.m.?
The provisions in the charter, I believe, do not set the hours that it has to be open. It just says that it has to be open for 9 consecutive hours.
That'd only be 8 hours.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever.
1 to 10.
Is that a concern? I mean, it might just.
It is statute only require that voting, that polls be open until 7.
That was the reason to change this to town elections from any election, is that those provisions govern the general and probably the primary, but I would have to double check the primary.
Because there are different polling hours, and with some towns, it's just they do a floor meeting when the meeting's done. But this is a question of when there is a ballot being cast.
And this is also a minimum of 9 consecutive hours.
I feel comfortable here. It allows them some flexibility for those town elections, but it's a little unusual. I think there are some other towns that have this language, but
I think we talked about it in another one somewhere.
I assure you, our intent is not to have elections. Say one or another.
Meeting/rave might have really great voter turnout.
Create.
if I could just get a name on the spirit of this afternoon we're having.
The sixth instance of amendment is in section 61. This is the fiscal year language, and it strikes the language at the end of the section. It strikes the words "and end at 12 midnight on the last day of the following December," so that the section will now read that the fiscal year shall commence on the first day of January.
Didn't come up with a better word than infinitesimal last second.
Well, Representative Chase did some high-level research on what the smallest possible fractional piece of time could be, and it is a
Zeptosecond.
zeptosecond.
Zeptosecond of midnight.
How many just?
And apparently not even the AI can operate that fast to spend the entire year's budget in a zeptosecond. So at least not yet.
All right, so if we ever need to rely on faster than supercomputers can compute fractions of time, we will rely on zeptosecond. I think picosecond after nano was an additional 3 points, but I don't know what's after that. Zeptosecond's pretty deep, right?
Zepto is 20 zeros.
Yeah, 20 zeros.
That should buy us some time.
I'm like having an existential crisis discussion.
All right, I think we got what we wanted out of the 6th or 7th instance of amendment, depending on who's time.
The seventh instance of amendment Strike section 63. This was the provision of the charter that governed public meetings on the proposed budget. It mirrored directly general law, but had some confusing language in it, and the committee elected to strike it because the town will still be able to use the general law provisions that effectively use the exact same timelines. So instead, it puts in a reserved title for section 63 so that we didn't have to renumber all the other sections in the charter. And who knows, maybe the town will come back soon with a new section 63. That is all, unless you want to pursue some of the technical corrections. There is one that likely has to be added that we can't take care of as part of the, spelling error correction before this gets printed. And that is, I was just trying to work on this during the fun. And that's that at the end of section 84, you can find this on page 32, line 2 into line 3. Something got lost here where the sentence was supposed to end, but instead of the sentence ending, there's comma or both, which makes no sense in the context and probably is a result of subdivisions being reorganized, dragged and dropped, and or both just being left behind at the end of this section. So I would recommend and suggest that that be struck and replaced with a period so that the sentence can end.
Okay.
We should do that. Sentence rest.
Sentence.
Finish.
Just trying to read this through.
Talent and budget requirements contribute.
Stop.
Really saying here. So each year, the utility will contribute to the town payment in lieu of taxes. And either a cash payment or the equivalent of free services. Equaling the amount of money would have been received by the town and Avalon real estate taxes or the department of privately owned utility. Or both.
Was the or both referring to services or money?
Maybe a period at the end would get us
Yeah.
where we need
Just
to
make
be.
it stop. Yeah. It might be a little bit clearer what they're saying. I had to read that 3 times to understand what the or both was trying to refer to. It might be a little clearer if we go back up to the top and after town of Linden in lieu of taxes and the what does the or both refer to? So now that I'm going back and
I don't know how it got there either.
Well, I think it's just saying it's like or both. It could be a blend of cash payment or services.
right.
So if you're trying to, you're like, I owe you 1,000, I'll give you 5 cash and 5 in barter. Which is silver bond.
You're absolutely right, because the description is, so there's either
It's an either
cash payment or it's the equivalent as described, comma, or both, period. So
Yeah.
let's just put a period in at the end there. I think that's what we're trying to do.
I think we untwined that twine. Yeah.
That is one heck of a sentence.
The original sentence that we presented did not have this or both in there. It was just that sentence. Now, taxes, where such department is, if it were a privately owned utility, period. So it's either a cash payment or the equivalent in free services in an amount that equals that.
So for a hybrid, allows for a hybrid of the two to equal the total sum.
Yes, because it says and or the equivalent, yes.
Okay, yeah.
The original language said and or.
The original language said, in lieu of taxes, in form of a cash payment and or the equivalent.
That's why this was put in there. A period should be put at the end of the sentence, even though it's a little more confusing because and or cannot be used in the Vermont statutes annotated because and or always means or.
Yeah.
So in order to get you to where you need to be, if you propose using the and/or, and I used to know the Latin term for what and/or is, because we got an entire presentation from Michael O'Grady as part of our continuing legal education about the use of and/or since Roman times, how it always means or, and it leads to great legal confusion. But if you want to get to the intent of and/or, you have to use or both. You have to end with the or both so that you can get the and the or.
Take your word for that.
Yep, we're gonna,
Can we cover if and or but now?
we're gonna put a period on the end of this paragraph. And this
I just rewrote the sentence.
I'm going to go check with the clerk of the house to see whether things like the period and the correction of the spelling of the word planning in the heading for subchapter 6 can be corrected through the clerk's office, since they are truly spelling and just missing period errors rather than having to build it into your amendment. That should take less than 5 minutes, and I can send you an updated draft 1.2 with the correct amendment numbering in it. And you'll be ready to go.
So here's what we're gonna do today. We're gonna take a little break. We're gonna double check on a couple of things while we're on that break. And we're gonna come back at, let's do 3:25, have plenty of time, if that works for folks.
One other thing, I don't remember, my notes aren't very clear about. Did we square away the issue with eminent domain?
That is not something that the committee asked me to do before I left this morning, but I can certainly.
Yes, I certainly have an issue
Remind me what section it
with
is.
that. I'm not sure even if it's,
Like they're related to the election.
the electric department. I think the reference was made to possibly being able to secure eminent domain ability through outside of the town boundaries, if they purchase or try to, or.
Yes.
Right, and I think the comment from Tucker was that Maria said, depending on how it might be interpreted, that might be a problem, but it might not be a problem. And that's why I mentioned to you that Lindenville Electric has easements and properties in 13 towns. And very likely, that's why this eminent domain would be useful to them in terms of development of the electric system.
I'm sure it'd be useful.
So otherwise.
Town, even though it's not in the host town, they have structures in 13 towns.
See.
Representative Higley, I'll also say that I neglected to bring up a note that I wrote down when I met with Maria on this issue, which is the subsection subsection E in
Page 28.
section 82, bottom of page 28.
I'm sorry.
28 states that the exercise of eminent domain for the powers described in subsection D, which includes the acquisition of real property, may be exercised in the manner prescribed by law, which would require the select board of the municipality to take the land. That is our understanding of how eminent domain exercised by a municipality can be conducted. So it is still gray, but the gray area is that does this delegate authority for the Board of Electric Commissioners to exercise eminent domain, or does that clause in the manner prescribed by law restrict them to only acquiring real property with eminent domain in the manner prescribed by law, which would require takings by the Board of Selectmen in the municipality where the real property is located?
I mean, I would hope that that's the way it is. That it would have to be the select board of the town where the land was in question, to the select board of that town would have to impose eminent domain, not the board of directors for the electric company.
And this is broken up from what was originally both in the charter amendment proposed through the merger and Stowe charter provisions, which are currently codified in Title 24 app. But this eminent domain power was baked into all of these powers in subsection D. And we broke it out as its own action when we were drafting so that it wasn't immediately bundled with all of those powers. And so that it would be clear from this construction that it's in the manner prescribed by law.
Okay, yeah, I get it now. I think I'm good.
I just want to look really quickly in the VSA. So what it says in Stowe's charter, if I'm looking at this right, these powers may be exercised through taking by eminent domain in the manner prescribed by law. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Yeah, that was lifted right out of Stowe, which is.
Oh, I just want to check, just to make sure.
Yeah, I think all of the same recourse and appeal and all that would apply. Anybody else have any last thoughts before we send Tucker